All right, let's go on to another story, our final story today, and it is one that is absolutely true and happening right now, and that is Djokovic down under and the tennis debacle that's happening with the Open there. Set this up for us, Steve. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to unpack with this, and now a Czech tennis player whose visa has also been canceled.
All right, I'll do good. This is not hard to set up. Like the Australian Open's only been happening since 1905, right? This is not news that there is going to be a tennis event, a Grand Slam in Australia in January every year. Everybody knew this was coming. Everybody knew that Djokovic is notoriously not vaccinated, and that he says it should be your personal choice. Everybody knew this was coming. The Australian, tennis set up an exemption process. Djokovic applied for an exemption. He received that exemption, and then the Australian government has stepped in and overruled its own people, and that is where we stand right now. And so the question is, should they have done this? Should they have overruled what was granted to Djokovic? So that's question number one. And then question number two is, you could say, should this even be a medical issue? Should an exemption be given to him? Because look, he has won, as many Grand Slams as anyone alive. There's 3 people who've won 20. He's one of the 3. Of course, it's Federer and Nadal are the others. He has won the last 3. He's won 9 of these Australian Opens. If he wins here, this is going to be the biggest Australian Open probably in probably a decade or so in terms of coverage and the like. And so should he have been if granted an exemption? I think you could have made that point clear that we want him here and let's put him in different protocols. They didn't do that. Instead, they went the medical route, and now they're backtracking. And I think the Australian government looks way worse than Djokovic. I think this is a fiasco. It's a debacle. You can use whatever words you want. And I don't think any of that should be applying to Djokovic. He didn't do anything wrong in this case.
Well, Steve, this is the interesting part, isn't it? I mean, I lived in Australia for 5 years, and there's a couple of things here. The strange intricacies between federal and state government, that seems to be playing out right now between the Victorian state government and the national federal government. The second thing is there is, how can I put this delicately, a mild paranoia in Australia when it comes to borders and closed borders and open borders and being swamped. It's part of the national psyche, this idea that this island is constantly being swamped. So there is a political element as well, Steve, isn't there? There are federal elections coming up, I believe, so in the next 4 months or so. Prime Minister Scott Morrison, in his speech about Djokovic, if he said the word borders once, he must have said it a dozen times. Borders, 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 border policy, strong borders. It plays strong to his demographic, doesn't it? To keep emphasizing a strong border policy with no exceptions for anyone. They even did this a few years ago with Johnny Depp's dogs. So then, when it comes to entrance into a country and quarantine and so on, there's a political element as well, Steve.
Well, and that's why I'm saying it's unfair to Djokovic. And then, Neil, you shock, right? Australia cares about its borders. Shock that Australia has gone through, Melbourne in particular, I think the longest lockdown of any city outside of China, and maybe even within China to have a lockdown. Everybody knew this was coming. Everybody knew that this was the number 1 tennis player in the entire world going to set the global record on Grand Slams. And so they should have everybody saw this coming. And they should have either said, we are not going to allow any medical exemptions for Melbourne and into Victoria, or we're going to allow them. But they're playing politics with this, Neil, and I think it's completely transparent what they're doing, as you mentioned, and I think it's completely unfair to Djokovic that they have put him in this situation.
Christopher Chang pointing out on Facebook Live about the Czech tennis player as well, who's now. She had a proper medical exemption, and now hers is being revoked. Mentioned in the sports segment this morning by Neil. But this, to me, at first I have to be honest with you, I was biased against Djokovic, and I thought, oh, what a prat! Here's another big sports star thinking he can flout the rules. But then, as you read the story about him and the Czech player, they went through and they applied for the exemption. They apparently got the exemptions through the proper channels in Australia, and now it's the internal Australian authorities, the checkpoint or border folks, that are fighting with each other. And so it makes Australia look worse than it does the tennis players in my reading of the situation. Does that seem appropriate?
No, that's exactly appropriate. The Australians could have done one of two things. Like, look what they do in the NFL, right? In America, where you have maybe the greatest quarterback today, Aaron Rodgers for the Green Bay Packers in terms of current play. He is unvaccinated. And so they have different rules for the unvaccinated than the vaccinated. He's supposed to wear his mask more often. He gets tested more often. He needs to isolate longer if he gets COVID. And so they said, we're going to have different rules for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Australia could have said one of two things. They could have said, we're going to have different rules for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. We're going to welcome Djokovic in and other tennis players who choose not to get a vaccine, which is legal. Or they could have said, we're going to have a zero tolerance policy. You want to come into our country, you have to be vaccinated. And they set up a process to give an exemption to that second standard. And then Djokovic and all the tennis players, they all lived up to that process. It's not Johnny Depp sneaking in his dog
Exactly.
on an airplane. And so that is why I think there's justifiable anger, from Djokovic, from his fans, from the president of his country against the Australians for playing politics with this.
Yeah.